You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyis with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make this show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed here as an associate producer with a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. Today's topic is the Manhattan Project Part 2, Building the Bomb. The work of designing and building the atomic bomb was not all done in one place. Los Alamos, New Mexico was where Oppenheimer set up shop and where the bomb itself was built, and it was tested at nearby White Sands. But components for it were produced all around the U.S. and Canada. Some of these, like Los Alamos, were set up as entire communities. There was no telling how long the project would take, and it would be much easier to convince those working on it to be involved if they could bring their families. The Army Corps of Engineers procured most of the land via seizure through eminent domain. Los Alamos was built around what had been the Los Alamos Ranch School, a boarding school for wealthy teenage boys. There were also members of local tribes who were removed from the land that would become the project center. Construction began in November of 1942, and people began moving in by February of 1943. Setting up Los Alamos was not as disruptive to the local community as other sites would be. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for example, was much more complex. The area was appropriately far from large population centers, but the land wanted by the Army was inhabited, in some cases by people whose families had been there for generations. Approximately 3,000 people were forced out of their homes with few weeks' warning at best and almost no compensation. The area was made a complete exclusion zone by the Army, meaning no one could enter without permission of the military. Where these people had lived, a community for the expected 13,000 residents was built. By the end of the war, more than 75,000 lived and worked in Oak Ridge. Here, enriched uranium was produced with 3 different methods. The first, electromagnetic isotope separation, involves separating the uranium atoms with a calutron, a type of cyclotron developed by Ernest Lawrence at the University of California at Berkeley, hence the name calutron. The Oak Ridge calutrons were first run by physicists, but they had a tendency to make adjustments to the equipment and try to repair it when it malfunctioned. These were replaced by young women who came to be called the Calutron Girls. Because most of them were right out of high school and so did not have a background in the sciences, they didn't try to make changes or fix anything, making their work much more efficient than their scientist predecessors. The second method, gaseous diffusion, put uranium atoms into a gaseous state, allowing the isotopes to separate by their atomic weight. The third method, liquid thermal diffusion, was not terribly effective on its own, but made the gaseous diffusion more effective by starting the enrichment process. Another of the production sites, Hanford, Washington, also saw population removal. Approximately 1,500 people, most of them farmers who had already planted that year's crops, were given short notice to leave. Some were allowed to return to tend and harvest their crops, but not all, and none of them were fully compensated for their losses. Additionally, the area was completely cut off from local tribes who had long-standing treaty rights to use it for hunting, fishing, and ceremonial purposes. Hanford produced plutonium for the project in 3 reactors set up along the Columbia River, a location chosen because of the availability of water to cool the nuclear reactors. In the end, everything was directed to Los Alamos, where the bomb itself, referred to as the gadget, would be constructed. Oppenheimer had initially estimated only 100 people would be needed for the work. By the time all was finished, the population of Los Alamos was almost 10,000. This included the families of all of those employed in the production of the gadget. The initial setup for the Hill, as the inhabitants came to call it, was to be a military laboratory, requiring that the researchers become commissioned officers and submit themselves to the military hierarchy and chain of command. This did not sit well with many of the scientists, and so a compromise was made to organize it as a university lab funded by the Army. Security clearance for some of the scientists was difficult. Even Oppenheimer himself had to wait, but General Groves opened the classified areas right away, with the understanding that clearance would come. Oppenheimer's core team consisted primarily of people already working on the project. His group from Caltech and Berkeley, researchers from University of Minnesota and University of Wisconsin. The latter team was led by Joseph M. McKibben, who would be the one to flip the switch to activate the Trinity test bomb. The group from Stanford under Felix Bloch, the metallurgical group that had already been working on the project prior to setting up Los Alamos, which included Edward Teller. From Princeton came Richard Feynman and the cyclotron they'd been using at Harvard. The wives of many of these men also found employment on the Hill, doing clerical work with the project or doing the things needed in the community that were not directly project-related, like teaching school. There were also some women who worked on the project itself. Lily Horning, for example, who had accompanied her husband to Los Alamos, held degrees in chemistry. When she asked to be included in the project work, she was initially assigned to the typing pool until she and her credentials were vouched for by the plutonium team. The researchers were organized into groups for different elements of the research: administration, theoretical, experimental physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering. There was also a British contingent who began as a separate group but were later integrated into the other groups according to their expertise, though their access to classified materials was limited. There was also research conducted on a hydrogen-based fusion method for the bomb, advocated for by Edward Teller, who was also one of the few people working on it. Oppenheimer didn't think the hydrogen model was as viable as the fission method on which they were already working. This was a point of contention between the two men and would remain so long after the Manhattan Project had concluded. And here, listeners, I have to say that I do not know enough about the particulars of the physics and chemistry involved in building the atomic bomb to actually explain any of it to you. If you are interested in the nitty-gritty details of how the bomb was put together, I highly recommend Richard Rhodes' Making of the Atomic Bomb. There were two potential designs for the bomb: the gun method, in which a subcritical mass of the material, in this case enriched uranium, is propelled into another, causing a critical mass and fission. The second was implosion, in which explosives are used to push the material together, causing it to reach a critical mass and beginning the nuclear chain reaction. The gun method was first built in a test device called Thin Man, and then was used for the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, which was called Little Boy. This design worked as expected when using enriched uranium, but when they tried it with plutonium, they found it to be too reactive. Plutonium could only be used with the implosion device, and considerably less plutonium was needed to produce the same level of explosion as the gun method did, with a great deal more of enriched uranium. Work on an implosion bomb began in mid-1944. This is the type that would be tested at Trinity and dropped over Nagasaki. The gun type, with its straightforward design, did not need a live test. On the 7th of May in 1945, the war in Europe ended with the surrender of Germany. The atomic program had been conceived to make sure the Allies had the bomb before the Nazis did, but by this point, there was no reason to stop the work. And even though the war continued with Japan, the upper echelons of the U.S. military had begun to shift away from how to conduct this war toward how a future war against the USSR would be conducted. The test had to be scheduled before the Potsdam Conference because President Truman wanted to communicate that the Americans could produce this devastating weapon, thereby influencing negotiations. The conference was set to begin on the 16th of July in 1945. The test was set for the day before. A location south of Los Alamos was chosen, the Alamogordo Bombing and Gunnery Range, now renamed the White Sands Proving Grounds. The area had been purchased by the U.S. government in 1942 and had been used for testing other equipment. A 30-meter-tall tower was built to simulate the bomb detonating above ground. Observation posts were laid out at 9,100 meters due north, south, and west of the tower. Another observation post for VIPs, including Groves, Vannevar Bush, Isidore Rabi, and James Conant, was set up 20 miles northwest. All of the observers were issued welding goggles and placed with their backs turned to the explosion. They were instructed not to look at the initial moment of it, but only after they could see the light on the hills in front of them. Edward Teller kitted himself out with not only the welder's goggles, but an additional pair of sunglasses beneath them, a pair of gloves, and a layer of sunscreen. He chose to watch the explosion itself rather than have his back turned like others at the observation post. Richard Feynman observed from a truck and declined the welder's goggles, arguing that the windshield would protect him from any damaging UV waves. Because of this, he was one of the few, and possibly the only, who saw the explosion unfiltered. 2 B-52 bombers also circled the area of the test to collect data to determine the best location for targeting. 50 cameras were set up at various locations to take not only photographs but to measure various wavelengths of radiation across the spectrum. The gadget was set off at 5:29 a.m. Mountain Time on the 16th of July. It produced a 24.8 kiloton explosion, a crater nearly 80 miles across with a depth of almost 1.5 meters, and a mushroom cloud that reached 7.5 miles into the air. The ground for 3,000 meters around the tower was turned to greenish glass, which was slightly radioactive. The tower itself was vaporized. It took 40 seconds for the shock wave to reach the observers, and the blast was felt as far as 100 miles away. At the time, it was thought that the fallout radiation would not go too far, and no real effort was made to measure it beyond the immediate area. Recent research has shown, though, that the fallout reached across North America over the next few days. The explosion was seen as far as 50 miles away, requiring a cover story about an accident at a munitions warehouse to be sent out. After the Hiroshima bombing, some limited information about the Trinity test was released to the public, and this included a retraction of that cover story. There was no question about the success of the tests, and thus the success of the nuclear program. The Manhattan Project had done what it had set out to do, build the bomb before the Germans. Now the question was how, or whether at all, it should be used. Thank you for listening. We would also like to thank our History with the Szilagys Patreon patrons, Ed Chinevere, Laura Dahl, Kris Hill, and Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagys. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome short and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows in the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on Twitter at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?